Okay, we're ready to get started again. If you please take your seats. Okay. All right, we're ready with our next speaker. Ron Paul. Ron Paul was a Republican presidential candidate in 2008 and 2012, and the Libertarian Party presidential candidate in 1988. He served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1976 to 1977, from 79 to 85, and from 97 to 2013. One of the country's most ardent defenders of freedom, peace, free markets, and sound money, Paul has long been a fierce critic of the Federal Reserve System, the IRS, the war on drugs, socialism, empire, interventionism, and the national security establishment. He has also been an ardent defender of civil liberties and a vocal critic of the USA Patriot Act, torture, indefinite detention, and NSA surveillance programs. A graduate of Gettysburg College and Duke University School of Medicine, Paul was a practicing obstetrician and gynecologist from the 60s through the 80s. The founder of the Ron Paul Institute, Paul is the author of several books on Austrian economics and classical liberalism, among which are The Case for Gold, A Foreign Policy of Freedom, In the Fed, Pillars of Prosperity, The Revolution, A Manifesto, Swords into Plowshares, and Define Liberty. And I might add, he is an absolute personal hero of, I think, every libertarian in the libertarian movement, especially me. The title of Ron's talk is Enemies, Foreign and Domestic. Please welcome Ron Paul.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bumper, and thank you for inviting me. You know, when I was back in Washington, I would give occasional speeches. I'd take time on a special order. You could get time, 5 minutes, sometimes even up to an hour. And the one thing that happened with those speeches, I did my very best, but I never had any applause. So, so I'm glad to come here and I get a little applause once in a while. So I need to boost my ego. But Bumper, it's great that you put this together. This is fantastic. And this organization, the Future of Freedoms Foundation, is a great organization. If you support it, and you should, because Bumper, it's really good. The only thing is I have a little bit of question about him. He has all these fantastic speakers and intellectuals, and then he went and invited a politician to come. So I don't know about that. But I want to tell you, though, Bumper, you did have a little competition for me to get here. I had this other invitation. It was really a tough choice. There was a meeting held, matter of fact, in the area. It was over in Chantilly. I don't know if you know what's going on over in Chantilly, but you know, I was tempted to do that. But then again, I got to thinking it would be much better to be among friends and feel safe and secure, because at that other place I might not have felt so safe. But no, it is great to be here. And of course, the title of my talk is, you know, defending and support the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Of course, many people take that oath, and sometimes they get a little bit confused on that, because when I went to Washington, I thought I had a pretty good understanding about the Constitution. But then, you know, we would go back and forth, and it turned out that my understanding was completely wrong, and they tried to convert me. But I had a little trouble listening to their arguments. They told me something about the Constitution should be more flexible, and it should be a living document. It shouldn't be overly rigid, and that's how you get into trouble. So I sort of struggled with that tremendously, and then I got to thinking, you know, one compliment that I get, that I don't mind getting this, because I think sometimes the compliments are embellished a little bit more than it need to be. But the one is that, how did did you go there? How did you put up with that nonsense and not have to join the gang? Because I was there for close to 24 years. And of course, the one thing is my goals were different. My goal wasn't to be the chairman of the committee, because to do that, you have to sell your soul, you have to raise money, a few minor little things like that. So in my case, I do believe that when people say about me not joining the gang, it's true. Matter of fact, the longer I was there, the more I became very skeptical of government per se, and I became more rigidly determined that the problem's not with the people as much as it is with the government, and the government is just way too big, too intrusive, and you have all this nonsense going on, and that is the reason I believe that it's important that we stick to our principles and not say, well, a little bit of government here, a little bit of the government there. So for that reason, I left Congress much more adamant being opposed to big government than the motivation I had to go to Congress. But, I think the whole issue, we talk about all that's going on today and in foreign policy, and the bickering that goes on. There's a lot of that. But the bickering that we hear, from my viewpoint, has nothing to do with the important issue, and that has to do with philosophy. I don't believe there's, two parties. I believe there's only one party there, and I think bipartisanship is very bad. I think coalitions are okay, but bipartisan, everything gets done by bipartisanship. The two parties have to agree with everything that's been done for the 50 years. They agree on funding and not even examining these security budgets and the CIA. They don't. It's always bipartisan. Going to war. Just let them go to war and we'll finance them. So it's always a bipartisanship. But I frequently would get the criticism that I'm overly rigid. And depends on what you're rigid about, depends on whether it's good or not. But I remember one time there was one of the members of Congress said, well, he was working to get a credentials that he was against corporate welfare. So the Export-Import Bank appropriation was coming up. So he wanted to cut it 5%, which meant nothing. And we had to vote, and it didn't pass. No way would dare, cut the Export-Import Bank. So the next vote I wanted to abolish the Export-Import Bank. So I supported the other gentleman's, amendment to cut it a little bit, but he wouldn't support mine. So I went up to him and I say, "Hey, look, I thought you were against this stuff. Why aren't you voting with this?" He says, "Ron, your trouble is you always just go too far." But I think this is one of the problems, whether it's foreign policy or domestic policy. If you concede the principle, I think you concede 100% of it. So if you say that we have to do such and such type of welfare program, or a little bit of war, a little bit of intervention, you concede this whole principle that we're supposed to do it. So I do think, although it's a goal that won't be easily achieved, you should take this principle, and much has been said today about non-interventionism. And I love that term, because non-interventionism tells you what liberty is all about. And it would go a long way for foreign policy as well. That we should be, if we believe in the cause of liberty, we should be non-interventionists. We should have a government that does not intervene in peaceful activity of all citizens. Just let us mind our own business. And of course, we should have a government that, if you believe in markets, you should have a non-interventionist government that doesn't try to regulate the economy. And just think of the thousands and thousands of pages of regulations that go on. So it's too much intervention. And of course, in foreign policy, it's way overblown, way too much intervention. But there was a time when it really bothered me when you started reading, revisionist history, because it challenged me, quite frankly, when I started reading a little bit about the lead up to World War II, and that there was supposedly knowledge, possibly, of what was going to happen at Pearl Harbor. I just didn't want to believe that. But my government. And so it took a long time to sort of soften my stand on that. But the same way, I was drafted in 1962 during the Cuban crisis, which was discussed here today. And then I was actually inducted into the service in the early 1961. I was the flight surgeon at the airport in San Antonio the day before Kennedy was killed, and I was in charge of the medical provision there. But there was no way at that time, when the assassination occurred, that I would say, our government may well have been involved. I wouldn't want to hear any part of that. And of course, things like, the shooting up of the Liberty is one thing, and what about 9/11 Commission? But I've come to a conclusion. I'll just see if you think this is a pretty good assessment. I think commissions are great. Have commissions, study all this, because when they're done, they really help you out if you're looking for truth. Look at what they've said and decide exactly the opposite is the truth. We would have frequent briefings after 9/11. We had plenty, and there were briefings all the time to tell us what's really going on. Well, I think I attended one, and it was disgusting because I thought it was all just propaganda. It was spin. It was trying to get you to endorse a policy. So I had a rule. I just didn't go. For two reasons: that you weren't going to hear the truth, and the second reason is you could read it in the Washington Post the next day if you wanted, because they'll put the information out. But no, the propaganda in Washington usually was just a distortion of what was going on, especially in foreign policy. But this whole idea of defending and supporting the Constitution, pretty important. So how many people have said this oath, in our government? And yet there's not a whole lot of support in defense of the Constitution. But I can simplify this, because the oath that is taken says against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Well, I've concluded that if you want to do that you really only have about 50% of that responsibility, because it's hard for me to figure out who's going to invade us and destroy our Constitution. That all comes from internally, and that's where the enemies are here. They're destroying our Constitution. Just look at the loss of liberty since 9/11. It's incessant, and we do it to ourselves. So that's, to me, there are a lot of enemies that are internal, and that should be our job as much as anything. But overall, how do we get to this point where we're so out of whack of what the intent was with our Constitution? And I think one of the most important issues that deals with it is the educational system. I think if you look at the last 50, 60, 70 years, matter of fact, it even started under Eisenhower, especially with the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and then the Department of Education, and now we have this totally bizarre, evil monstrosity of cultural Marxism, which is pushed by our universities. I mean, what kind of a university system do we have today where you can send a kid off, gets a fancy degree, and studies something in social studies? He ends up with a degree and $70,000 worth of debt, and he can't get a job, and he's supposed to be educated. It's a real mess. And the longer the federal government especially has been involved, the worse the educational system has become. I think it's an indoctrination system. I think it starts in kindergarten, and it's very simple. And this is why I like the simple answers to the problems. There is no authority in the Constitution for the federal government to be involved in education, and it should be taken out. They get rid of the Department of Education, and maybe something much better could replace it. Because of the system and what goes on, this is a great influence. The people I knew in Congress, many of them I considered very decent, but very confused. And they didn't understand economics, at all. And they reflect, what they've been told and what they've been studied. How many universities still today teach interventionist economics, Keynesianism, and whose most popular book in all the universities? Paul Samuelson. And it had nothing to do with sound money and free markets and this sort of thing. So and that's why the majority of the people that come to Washington are going to do what they do, and they feel good about it. And once they accept this notion that there's something wrong with an overly rigid Constitution, and they have the security to adapt the Constitution, and then they get indoctrinated in our educational system, then we end up with this mess that we have. And yes, the details are important, and I spent a lot of time leading up to the Iraq War dealing with trying to point out all the reasons we shouldn't do it. I think one time I had one talk, I listed 34 reasons why we shouldn't do it, and that's important to do that. But overall, it's really the principle of the thing. Should we be involved? And the founders sort of gave us a hint: stay out of entangling alliances. We don't need this internationalism. We need more emphasis on personal liberty, personal responsibility, and not internationalism. If education, there was no prohibition about the states or local communities being involved with education. I went through public school, and it was only the local community. And then the communities got bigger. Then the state took over. And then it was the federal government took over. And now it's the United Nations and everybody else that wants to get in on the act. And that is what's wrong. So I think that if you take a firm principle and say they shouldn't be involved, then things would be much better. Now, if you look at all our foreign policy, you say, well, how do they do this? Where do they get all the money? Well, they had to have a neat little system to finance this. This and welfare, the welfare warfare state, is very, very real, and it's deadly. And of course, if you go back to a few years prior to World War I, if you go back to 1913, they were already setting the stage. They were setting the stage in 1 year. They said that your income is not your income. It all belongs to the government, and we'll allow you to keep it if you do what we tell you. And if you don't do what we tell you, you will have to prove you're going to be considered guilty until you prove yourself innocent. So we started off small, and we had the income tax, and of course, along with that we had the viciousness of another instrument that I think that we should be concerned about, and that is another enemy of liberty, and that is central banking. You cannot solve these problems unless you deal with the monetary issue, and the best way to deal with that is the same way you deal with the Department of Education. You need to get rid of the Federal Reserve System. And of course, all the agencies and the internal revenue, the whole works. We just don't need that. But the conditions that really excite people, though, will be, we have to be an international leader. We have to be the leader of the community. We have to be a world leader. Americans like it. Everybody likes it. I like the idea. I think we should be a world leader. But their idea, the opposition, their idea of a world leader is we own it, that we have an empire, and we support it, and you do it with a gun. I have another idea about supporting world leadership, is why couldn't we have a country based on personal liberty, non-intervention in our lives, non-intervention in the economy, non-intervention in other people's affairs, have sound money and free markets, and set a standard and be the real leader of the world, not because we're telling them what to do, but because maybe they would like to emulate what we're doing because of our success. That is my idea of being a world leader. The chances of that happening, of course, aren't all that good right now. But, like so many things, there's a good a good part and a bad part. And right now, it's real easy to talk about all the bad things because this last 100 years has not been kind to liberty. And although there's great prosperity, because if you own stock, you should feel real good. But for some reason, owning stocks right now, from my viewpoint, is superficial, and it doesn't reveal what's really going on in this country. And if you look and see what's happening in this country and who's doing it and who is the enemy, you have some sorting out to do. Right now, I am convinced at least half of our population, are in trouble financially. And even the economic statistics this week, revealed this. They have 95 million people that are out of the workforce. So what does that do? They're out of the workforce, so there are less people considered to be workers, and the unemployment rate's down to 4.3. So does that make everybody feel good? Well, Wall Street feels good. So it's gimmickry. And of course, when they ran into trouble in 08 and 09, what did they have? They have a real financial crisis. Well, let's go to the Congress and see what they can do because it's their responsibility. Well, they'd spend $1 billion here, $1 trillion here and $1 trillion there, saying they're going to solve that problem. But it was all fluff. It didn't do any good. We know that. Debt actually doubled since that time. It went from 10 to 20 trillion dollars. But while the Congress is tinkering around with $1 trillion here and there, the Fed is tinkering with 15 or 17 trillion dollars and passing it out to make the economy great. There's a 500% increase in the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, and quite frankly, it's not going to last, and it will just distort things. It will. The enemy, the philosophic enemies will have created this condition where there is a maldistribution of wealth. And so when the liberals complain about that, they're right. That why is this group over here more billionaires than ever before? Now we're going to have a trillionaire, and yet 50% of the people really are underemployed. And it's a consequence, though, of the government. It's a consequence of the Federal Reserve. It's a consequence of what happens when you destroy a currency. But right now, we're able to do this, through the Federal Reserve System. The people, they accept this whole notion that it's all right to pretend that what you need is inflation of money supply and money is wealth, and that'll solve the problem, which obviously isn't true. The report this past week tells us a little bit about what's really going on. New York City has a tremendous number of people who are homeless. The story yesterday was on L.A. L.A. had a tremendous increase in people living on the street. And they went and somebody did an interview and they talked to some of the people who were homeless. And it wasn't like they weren't working. Some of them were working and trying to pay the bills. And they were saying, my cost of living is too high and I can't do this and I can't afford the rent. And because it's too high, cost of living going up, rent's going up, I work and it's not enough. And what does our Federal Reserve say? Well, we do have a problem here, and we want to energize the economy. And how we energize the economy is we need to take the price inflation rate up to 2%. And we need more inflation and cause prices to go up, and rising prices to them is a sign that there's prosperity. It didn't help Zimbabwe and it didn't help Venezuela. Prices soar. But this is the ridiculousness of the system that we have. But right now there's a bit of euphoria and people are feeling great. And we have been able to capture this by, being in a position of printing and creating the reserve currency of the world. And that, of course, really came out, and some speakers alluded to the strength of the United States after World War II. And it has been very strong and very trusting. We have the military, we have the wealth, and they trust us to a degree, but less all the time. But we've been able to do this, and deficits can be handled to the point, but it's all an illusion confusion. And I think it all goes back to this idea that we as Americans should really question who the enemies are. What are the odds right now of some country coming in here and invading and taking over? Maybe after the chaos, who knows what's going to happen. But even, today we're in the Persian Gulf. I guess you realize we're over there. We have a few vessels over there and planes and bombs and drones. And we have, we're very much involved in making sure that nobody drags up a lot of sand and makes a new island in the South China Sea. What would we do? What would the Texans do if they did that in the Gulf of Mexico? What if they did it in the Chesapeake Bay? And nobody wants to, in our country, they generally don't want to look and put the same calculation on ourselves as on others. And they too readily accept this idea that we are an exceptional nation and that we have goodness to spread. And all you have to do is look and where all that goodness is and ask whether or not the military-industrial complex is enjoying this goodness, because they're part of the real problem. And so this is sort of inherent in the system. And until we look at this from an intellectual viewpoint and decide, what should our country be all about? Should we be defending and protecting liberty, or should we pretend that we know how to run people's lives? And so, what are you going to do? Let the people die in the streets? They won't have any medical care. And we know that's all a fraud. The more people are suffering from lack of medical care now since the government's been involved. It's a disaster what's happening, and there's no way they can afford it. Once again, how could we solve that problem? Get the government out of believing, and the American people believing, that it's the federal government's responsibility to distribute medical care. They shouldn't be doing it. They don't have a right to do it. The one thing that has motivated many to support our foreign policy is this whole idea that there's a danger of terrorism. Well, there is a danger of terrorism, but if you've seen the statistics, comparatively speaking, they're rather minor. I think you have 100 times greater chance of getting hit by lightning than by a terrorist. And if you looked at city crime and inner city crime and the results of the drug war and how many people die, and I think it's something like 88 in a day, and yet you're talking a dozen or two or three from terrorism. But you got to build the fear of an economic collapse, and that's why the Fed has to do this and why Congress has to spend more money. The same way on the militarism, they're dangerous, they're coming, they're going to get us, and we have to go and stop them over there. And, the other biggest hoax on this foreign policy and this intrigue about defending the Constitution, a lot of people, how often do you hear on TV now on why we have to be over there and why we had to go into Iraq? The justification was to go into Iraq to defend our Constitution and defend our freedoms. How ridiculous can it get? To go in, you're defying the Constitution. It was an undeclared war, and we've made ourselves so much less free. And people buy into this stuff. But fortunately, we still have vehicles. We have the Future of Freedom Foundation and a few others that's going to get this message out, because it can be changed. And that's where I tend to be a lot more optimistic than you might believe, because the chances are going to be numerous. Because the one thing for certain is that the system that we have, endless spending, endless debt, endless inflation of the money supply, endless intervention, it's going to end. It's going to end. And the big problem, though, that we have to face is, how is it going to end? Is it going to be so chaotic that there be decades of real chaos where we can't survive and make it difficult? Or will it be an opportunity? And I think that it will be an opportunity, because I think today we have more groups giving out information like the Future of Freedom Foundation and others. And there's a lot of young people studying Austrian economics. There's a lot of people who do care and understand what civil liberty is all about. Even though the campuses are a mess, I still go to the campuses, still can get some people out, and there's a lot of people there that are on the right track. And the one thing that encourages me is I never look and say, well, I need to go out there. One of my biggest rallies I had in the presidential campaign was at Berkeley, believe it or not. I mean, it was huge. But if I went there and thought, well, I got to get 51% of the people at Berkeley agreeing with this, it would be just too devastating. And but there's always some there, and in large numbers, and they're enthusiastic. And a young person, if they get the right information, they realize that they have a lot at stake. And I think it's very encouraging on what's happening, and that there's reason to believe that some good can come of this. I keep thinking of this in the big picture, and the big picture for me is what's happened, for literally hundreds, if not thousands of years about the human race developing. Not much really happened, in the sense of technical developments up to about 300 years ago. You think of what was before that. There was a lot of fancy things, but really the fantastic technology, and even today technology is improving the living condition. And yet every time we improve the living condition, it seems like we use the technology not only for some people's living condition improving, but it's also used to fight wars and kill people more efficiently, drop bigger bombs, and get more involved. But the people who understand this realize that there could be a different way. Why is it that if we made this great change in the human race by technology, and just in the last 100 years, really, there's been fantastic technological advances. But what about the human race advancing otherwise? Why can't we advance on how we get along together? That would be a real chore, wouldn't it? But I still come down on the side that I think most people are decent, but not in Washington. Washington's a different story. Because, well, anyway, why they go there is a different story. But no, I keep thinking, my wife and I are raising kids. We lived in several states and 5, 6 different houses, and we had neighborhoods. I can't remember once where I worried about my neighbor. My neighbors were always good neighbors. Sometimes we didn't talk much, but we never had to worry about them, and sometimes they would help each other. So I think I think there's more goodness in people than we give them credit for. I think the problem is that the people who like authoritarianism, to tell people what to do, they know it's illegal for an individual to go into your house and take what they want. Fortunately, that moral standard still exists. You can't personally take from people and hurt people. It happens, but basically most people recognize you can't do it. But it's not illegal for the government to do it. This is why it's so important, if there are some good rules for us to have a good community and getting along with people, we as a country and as a people, what we have to do is hold the feet to the fire of government, where those individuals that go to government are not allowed to use force or violence to try to have their way in any way whatsoever. That, I think, would make a difference. And there is only one rule you have to think about, and it's not a complex rule. I mean, we have, what are the Keynesian interventionists and people who want to manage these interventions formula? Boy, you have to have a lot of rules, and figure out, well, you do it on this hand, on this hand you do this, write more regulations and all. But there's only one rule that you need, and that is the rule that we apply to ourselves. We don't have a right to hurt people. We don't have a right to steal from people. And those are ancient traditions, thousands of years old. Plain and simple, don't lie, cheat, steal, or kill. And yet we have governments involved probably in killing. You know, who knows what? So we certainly have our government involved in killing, you know, with these undeclared, illegal, immoral wars. You know, like a million Iraqis have died since we went in there to save that country. It's just utterly tragic what goes on. So how do you do that? I think the founders tried to solve that problem. They tried to give us what they called a republic, keep the government very small, advise us to stay out of entangling alliances, allow a national defense, but it didn't work. So how do you do it if it's natural for people who love authoritarianism to go where they can use their authoritarianism, and it hasn't worked? So what is the other option? I think the other option is we need to change our idea of what the nature of government is. And that is, don't permit a government that can do these things. And if we could just allow that to happen, when it happens, people do so much better. You know, it's not like they don't. It's not like if tomorrow all government was wiped out in a minute with medical care. Believe me, you know, there would be some adjustments pretty fast. Fees would come down a whole lot, let me tell you. And the insurance company wouldn't be breaking off the top. And the drug companies wouldn't be abusing the system. The management companies that are involved. All that expense that we've experienced for the last, not only on Obamacare, because the Republicans have introduced a lot of that too. It's government intervention that caused all these prices to go up. So if you eliminated all these middlemen, believe me, it would be so much better. Today, even today, under these conditions, there are people who stake out totally private hospital and they just take cash and that's it, and they're out of the system, and it actually worked. So when we have difficult situations like this and we're trying to find out who the real enemies are, what we have to do is make sure there's always a loophole for everybody to opt out. That was probably the most onerous thing about Obamacare, that you couldn't get out. You had to be pushed into that thing. But you ought to always be able to opt out. The educational system, in a way, has an opt-out in it. We can get out of it, even though it's not universally available. But they did try in the 80s to make sure that you couldn't homeschool your kids, and there was an attack on homeschooling and private schooling, and they want to regulate private schools still. But if you can get out of the system, and if they eliminate any option to get out, whether it's medical care or education, that is very, very bad. And we're at that point where opting out is more difficult. So I think this is one thing that we could do, but I believe that this is a non-viable system that we have, and the enemies are more philosophic than they are just individuals who are misled. I think there's a philosophy behind this. I think cultural Marxism isn't accidental of people who was gently misled. They have goals to cause chaos, cultural chaos, for a strategy to destroy, you know, the culture that we have. And sometimes we come up with these questions about how do you protect civil liberties and protect everybody's religious liberties and sexual liberties inside, you know, public institutions. Well, the best way is get rid of the public institution. and then if it's a private institution, if it's a religious institution or a private institution, you get to write your own rules. Oh, well, that introduces some other problems. That means that you might have to make choices on who can come and who can go. Well, you know, in freedom, actually, you are allowed to make your own choices. And one other word that they've destroyed is to be discriminatory. We're all discriminatory. Everything we do, you made a choice to come here. I made a choice to stay away from Chantilly. Now, we always make these choices. It's constant. But they want to make you believe that you're not allowed to pick and choose. Well, we do. We pick our people who come into our house. We pick schools and all these things. So it's constantly making choices, but they don't want to. Somebody else is supposed to make those decisions for us, and that is what's so hard for people to understand. Is in civil liberties, if people use their liberties to do things that we might not like, how can we tolerate them? Because we don't agree with them on this. If they do the one thing, don't use force. You know, and we just sort of say, you mind your own business, do what you want, call yourselves whatever you want, but you cannot take your standards and push them and force them on somebody else. Society would work, but the people who are in opposition to us, they're not looking for peace and tranquility. They're looking for chaos, and right now they're on the verge of getting their chaos. But we have to always look for a solution and an opportunity. The one other issue I want to touch on before I close, and that is the privacy issue. Because we do want to be safe and we do want to be secure, and there's a room for a little bit of surveillance, but it should be strict. It should be strict. And the founders thought about this. This mass surveillance of all Americans, this is atrocious. But if you had the whole system of having search warrants and all, and there are so many solutions. There's one agency, I don't know whether anybody here has ever been annoyed by TSA. Anybody in this room been annoyed by TSA? I'd like to get rid of the TSA. And I voted against the TSA. It should be private. It should be the private people dealing with their customers. And that means there's technology now where they can scan people so fast. And that's one part of technology that wouldn't destroy productive jobs, because the TSA agents would have to go get a productive job, and we would have better security than ever before. So but privacy is very, very important, and that is a principle of liberty. But the solution is understanding where the importance of our life, liberty, and our property, and that it's a natural right, and it's come to us in a natural ways, in a beneficial way. And if we have enough people, and believe me, it doesn't need 51%, it needs 10% at the most to change people's attitudes, and that's why you're here, and that's why you're part of that group, and that's why you can have a lot of influence, and that's why I'm optimistic. I want to thank you very much today.
We have a 25-minute break, and we got appetizers out in the hallway.